Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Last year, during my first post-COVID visit to China, I was struck by the sheer volume of electric vehicles on the streets. The transformation since my last visit in January 2020 was astounding. It felt as if every car, including taxis, had been replaced by EVs from brands and with technologies I never encountered. I couldn't help but wonder how such a massive shift had occurred in such a short time. In this episode, I explore China's automotive industry with Bill Russo, a seasoned auto industry expert who began his impressive career in automobility in Detroit, then to China with Chrysler. My goal is to understand how China ascended in 3 decades to become the world's leading automobile market, manufacturer, and exporter, and a global leader in new energy vehicles, batteries, and, as Bill puts it, the Internet of Mobility. We delve into China's policymaking from the 1990s, which laid the groundwork for a sustainable economic future. Our discussion covers how China integrated Western automotive expertise through joint ventures, leveraged long-term public and private investment in infrastructure and mobility, and how internet giants such as Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi supercharged data aggregation and technological innovation. These factors collectively propelled China to its current leadership in mobility. It's clear that China's focus isn't just on hardware manufacturing, but on intelligently and comfortably integrating technological innovations to enhance movement. Given the competitiveness of China's automotive industry, how should American auto businesses adapt, and what will be the impact of Trump's tariffs on the future of the American auto industry? Let's hear Bill's perspective. Welcome, Bill. We're really excited to have you today. You're such an expert in, auto industry, especially with China. So can you just share with the audience, how did you get started?
Yeah, thank you, Wenchi. I think the long journey, auto industry I've been involved with since the late 1980s. Initially, my career, I worked at IBM, but I supported automotive clients. The focus was mainly the auto industry for part of my career at IBM, and then I joined the industry in 1992 and worked at Chrysler for 15 years.
And that in the U.S. or was that already in China?
I was in Detroit for 17 years prior to coming to China in 2004, and I was the head of Chrysler's Northeast Asia business for the first 4 years of my time in China, and I've been here now 21 years. The auto industry in China was always the growth engine for the automotive industry. Since the turn of this century, the industry growth can owe itself almost entirely to China, which has added about 30 million units to the global auto industry's total production volume. But at a time at that time, there were very few customers buying personally owned vehicles in the early part of the century, but that's changed dramatically over the course of the last 25 years. It's now risen to being a more than 30 million unit a year market. In production, in sales, it's been 26 to 27 million units of annual volume, and most of that's retail purchases. So it was attractive to the global auto industry because it was a place that you could scale and you can add profits and volumes, and that was very important, especially to the U.S. automakers. In fact, some would argue that the U.S. automaker GM, which went through a restructuring in the global financial crisis, probably owes its existence today to the profits that it was making in China.
Can we pause? Let's just go back a little bit. I'm always curious what brings people to China. And you didn't go to China until 2004, I assume, with the auto, whichever company.
Chrysler. Yeah, so I had never been to Asia until 2003. And I had my first projects which brought me initially to China in the fall of that year. Basically, I was head of strategy at Chrysler, working for the CEO. The industry was searching for growth. Places like the United States, its golden era was the middle part of the 20th century and faced lots of competition coming from East Asia, initially Japan and Korea. But then when China opened up, post-1989, with the Deng Xiaoping reforms and the opening up, that the China market was about to explode as the population and earning potential of the individuals within the country grew. In that 2003-4 timeframe, we kicked off a strategic initiative to evaluate growth opportunities in China. I led an exploratory team, came to China with a group of folks, and within 6 months of making my first visit to China, I was assigned here to build up the local production volume for Chrysler as the market was expanding. It was a great period in history, that 2001 post-WTO accession to 2009. China went from almost nothing to being the largest car market in the world by 2009.
So when you arrived, you said when you arrived in 2004, do you still remember, can you describe what was it like on the street? What did you see in terms of transportation?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was, ownership is not the way people moved around. Owning and driving a car, and I lived in Beijing for the first 9.5 years that I lived in China, and bicycles would stop traffic. Most people moved around on vehicles with their own propulsion system, their legs, right?
And was it still primarily bicycles in 2004?
Yeah, I remember I was living up in Xinyi, and I would take the ride down to Chaoyang district, and when you got off the airport expressway, the road that connects you to the northeast suburbs, you had to wait probably about 30 to 40 minutes for the bicycle traffic to clear out of the intersection to just get off the freeway. More people ride than drive, even today. And that's, I think, some of the things that Western people learn when they come to China, is that ownership is not necessarily the aspiration. Driving is not necessarily the aspiration in a densely populated urban environment like we have here. So, and that's been one of the things that has been challenging as this industry goes through its current phase of electrification. Driving experience is not necessarily aspirational. It's in-cabin comfort. Things that make Chinese people think about getting in a car is really getting out of public transport, getting off a bicycle into a personal space. That's more what the aspiration is for the transition. But the industry came here because of growth, because of, frankly, a ability to scale. If you're going to compete in a global industry, you need to be able to build large volumes of a manufactured product at low enough cost. And I'd say that is still the attraction of doing business in China. It's the biggest market in the world. 1 out of every 3 cars in the world are made in China. And if you want economies of scale working for you, the Chinese supply chain has been built up in such a way that you're going to get the best cost structure by leveraging the commoditized hardware components that are available in a very efficiently scaled supply chain in China.
So the first phase that you referred to, the JV phase, do you think there was this thinking that whole ownership was possible and then China would become the largest automobile market?
There was no central plan that said we're going to be the biggest and we're going to dominate because we're huge. I think what happened over time is it became evident that the market offered growth. Right, that's what people originally came. They came here for cost efficiency initially. I think most of the multinational companies were sourcing components even before they were assembling cars, because the opportunity to access a supply side cost advantage was what I think most of the global auto industry came here for. And what happened in the late 20th century is the industry became a global industry. It was initially post-World War, if I just say, start in 1950. The U.S. automakers, the big 3, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, in 1950 had 76% of the world's automobile production. Fast forward to 1990, the U.S. by then had lost its number 1 position to Japan. The Japanese had about 28% of the world's automobile production, and the U.S. had fallen to about 20%. And
The Japanese were selling to Americans, right?
it was
It
made in
wasn't.
Japan, selling to the world. And the Japanese had the dominant position in being able to produce affordable, good quality, and affordable passenger vehicles. So the American auto industry shrank, largely because of the cost penalty of building in the United States versus building your supply chain in other markets.
Was it largely because of labor or there's something else?
Labor, land costs, building up, the whole infrastructure for a heavy manufacturing industry, you end up with a relative disadvantage. We were thousands of dollars gap in ability to produce a car at a similar price. And it was all the factors, land cost, labor cost, all the contributing factors that leads to a less than level playing field. But if you remember back in 1990, CEO of the company that I joined, Chrysler, was Lee Iacocca. A lot of his career was around buy American, made in Japan, bad for our economy, made in the USA is better. But what an interesting thing happened,
Similar to this time.
very similar. I mean, if you're old enough to remember back to the 90s, you think, okay, I've seen this rhetoric before. He never ran for president. He thought about it. Part of my attraction of going to Chrysler is I was charmed by Lee Iacocca. I graduated from Lehigh University with a master's degree, and he was the most famous graduate from that school. And I graduated in 1987, is the year I moved to Detroit. So I was very much attracted to the company and its leader. And I wanted the U.S. auto manufacturing industry to win. I think we all want it to win. But we have to win in a different playing field now, because that was the 90s. Fast forward to 2000. By that time, there were already the initial investments being made, mainly to mitigate this gap in the cost advantage of the U.S. versus Japan. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler all established sourcing offices so that they can buy parts to assemble into vehicles that they assemble around the world that were lower cost, in leveling that cost gap disadvantage that we had relative to the East Asian countries, which by then included the Koreans as well. So Korea, Japan was the existential threat to the Western auto industry. And what happened after 1990 is Japan started building factories around the world. Not only in China, everyone built factories in China. Everyone built factories in China. But Japanese started building factories in Ohio, Texas, North America, in the backyard. So it wasn't made in Japan. It was created in Japan, made in America, that became, or made in the region where they were selling the cars. That's what a global auto industry eventually does, is you don't end up building everything at home. You build it where the customer is, but you keep some of the critical know-how at home, right? You want to have access to the things that make your brand special, and that should be something that you hold inside of your moat. But come to the present day, post-2000, China enters the mix. The auto industry, post-WTO 2001, the floodgates of investment open up. China becomes the market that can superscale the supply chain and offered the growth opportunity that was absent everywhere in the world. When the Japanese went to the United States, it wasn't because the U.S. was growing. It was because they can compete and substitute for the American passenger cars with Japanese passenger cars. It was a substitutional challenge to the U.S. auto industry. China offered an incremental growth opportunity to everyone in the world, and it also offered the opportunity to create a supply chain scale that was unrivaled on the planet. So you came here for rational reasons. You came here for growth. You came here for global system-wide cost efficiencies. And since 2000, China's gone from 1 million units, 2000, about 1 million units to now over 30 million units. All of the incremental growth of the 21st century comes from China. But the hard thing that's happened in the most recent years is the Chinese brands have risen from being followers to being industry leaders in the current market in China.
I read a piece that you wrote for Kurt Gibb's book, Selling to China. You had a whole chapter on the mobility industry. Between the years of 2000 and 2009, it was primarily foreign investment that was
Yeah.
driving China's automobile industry. And then from 2010 to 2017 was policy driven to market driven. Can you elaborate on these two periods to help us understand what China went through to come to today?
Yeah, it's very much you have to segment the time periods because early in this was a market that opened up, but it wasn't a consumer-led market. It was foreign investment that came in, building up
And it was
the.
mostly American, German, Japanese.
If I'm viewing it through the lens of the auto industry, yeah, those are the three automotive centers in the world. Actually, it was the Americans and Germans first, right, with Chrysler, Volkswagen, and then General Motors. That first era up to 2000, there were only a handful of JVs. Post WTO, 2001 to 2009, and I put the date at a non-round number of '09 for a reason, because that was the year where China became the largest car market in the world. It was also the global financial crisis that hit the industry globally, but China didn't really have a pullback. It actually accelerated its growth through that period because of the growth of the middle class population. So the shift from forex led supply side driven market expansion to true demand driven market expansion happened in the post financial crisis timeframe.
So China went from still mostly bicycles to what's the ownership like?
Yeah, well, we've got a population of 1.4 billion people and a car population that is about less than a third of that. So the
Still
ratio of
tremendous.
cars to people is still people outnumber cars by more than 3 to 1 in China today. So that says more people ride than drive. If they're moving around on a shared ride or a bicycle, public transport. That's the bulk of the population. And in fact, because of the urbanization, which in China now is more than 2/3 of the population lives in cities, owning and operating a vehicle and even parking a vehicle is it's painful. Owning a car is relegated to, yes, it's still an aspirational purchase, but it's not a commuter tool. It's
Yeah.
a family use vehicle, which I think is what's happened recently. Is early buying was I want to get out of the bike, I want to get off the bike, I'm rich enough.
It's
I
also
want to show,
status,
yeah, I want
right?
to show my status. And owning foreign was aspirational. And the foreign brands dominated this industry for the first part of this from 1984's entry until 2020. The foreign brands had 2/3 or more share of the passenger vehicle market in China. So when the market changed from, I'd say policy driven to market driven, it was this expanding middle class population rising from the base of the pyramid to where now I can afford to own. Affordability mattered to a population that's skewed toward first time buyers who are younger on average. Value for the money was always a thing. And that brought Chinese brands into the equation. In the 2010 to 2017 period, Chinese brands, especially in lower tier regions of China, which were growing very rapidly.
What are some of the brands at that time?
You've got the state-owned companies like Beijing Auto, Shanghai Auto that have their own brands, but I think the probably most well-known brands in the early part were Hongqi, the first auto works, sold mainly to government officials. The Dongfeng has its own brands. Chang'an Auto has its own brands. A very popular brand for lower tier China was a brand called Wuling, which General Motors produced alongside Shanghai Automotive as a partner with a regional government from Guangxi province, making very low cost, very low priced entry level products. Early on, the Chinese brands, the beachhead for Chinese brands was first time buyers and affordability. And I'd say that's because the brands from China, and I'm talking in the east to 2000 aughts time frame and even into the teens. The Chinese brands were really the followers, and they were sold purely on value for the money, affordability, make it cheaper. And that was the condition that we had during the pre-electrification era. The things changed after 28. But prior to that, it was Chinese brands have to go it was a race to the bottom. It was sell it affordably. And the consumers that were shopping, that were buying the foreign branded products, really were not cross-shopping the Chinese brands back then. Why would you that you would be...
It's a different class.
Well, you would be saying to people, I can't afford to own a BMW or a Buick if I buy this Dongfeng car.
Yeah.
So, you would never see in a city like Shanghai, outside of a taxi fleet, you would never see, and even in the taxi fleets, there were mostly Volkswagens in Shanghai.
Right.
Or Hyundais in Beijing.
Yeah.
Even the fleet vehicles were foreign branded then. They're not now. I mean, hardly ever see in a taxi a foreign brand anymore because, frankly speaking, the Chinese brands have caught up in terms of build quality, in terms of capability. But this is the part that I don't think the global industry bargained for, is all of that had been built over the course of time through a policy-led environment that required foreign investment to come to China on the back of a 50-50 joint venture policy. So all of what was happening in China was built in collaboration with foreign and local partners. If you built a car in China, you had a JV partner. You could own only up to 50% share of your Sino-foreign joint venture. That was the policy from 1984 until 2017. The seeds of all of what happened up until 2017 were guided by an industrial policy for building up what they consider to be a pillar industry for the future economic development of the country.
You've lived in China long enough to probably have observed this, and I think it's a relatively foreign concept to Western countries, to the US. Across all industries, all sectors, China always wanted joint venture first because they wanted to learn until they feel comfortable enough. After a few decades of fostering their own domestic industry, they feel comfortable, secure enough to relax the joint venture.
Yep.
50% ownership so they can be on their own, and which is what we're seeing today for your particular auto industry. So I want to talk about that. The last few years, China's EVs have really taken over the world. Would you attribute it primarily to this relaxation of this 2018 policy?
No, I think that was a step that came far later than the industrial policy direction. Now, if I back up a little bit from 2018, because 2017-18 was when they implemented the adjustment that allowed foreign electric vehicle manufacturers to own 100% of their production of the assets that they deploy to produce electric.
Only electric. So
initially only for electric. Now it's broader, but initially for electric. But prior to that, let's go back to the turn of this century. There were, one of the things I credit to the statecraft that China practiced over this century was the recognition that in order to create a sustainable economic future, one of the core elements of that sustainable economic development was going to center on innovation related to mobility. Mobility is the circulatory system of the economy, whether it's people moving or goods moving. And the historical link between mobility innovation and economic development, you could draw that arc back over centuries, right? The Vikings, right? The British Empire. Why were they empires? Because they could move things around the world.
They have the ships.
They had the ships. They built production capacities to turn raw materials into finished products. That was the economic engine of the development of some of the pre-industrial and post-industrial era. Now, post-industrial era, the dominant nation on the planet in the 20th century was the United States. Mobility innovation was its defining characteristic of its economic development. Henry Ford with the automobile, the Wright brothers with flight, the space program, the idea that moving mobility was going to be the engine of technological innovation and economic development. China wasn't just sitting there inside the Great Wall of China, not noticing this. They say, okay, mobility innovation is the hallmark of sustainable economic development. The U.S. is the benchmark. What do we do in the 21st century to make ourselves, not to put everyone else out of business because they're here helping us learn? What do we do to put ourselves on the playing field? Let's innovate around mobility. And the policy and the practice of statecraft as a way to add a tailwind to that development was very clearly played out over the time that I've been here. And it's not just in the automobile sector. I mean, in the automotive industry, you can go back to the turn of the century where they said the intellectual property dominance of the global auto industry is around the internal combustion engine. Well, maybe we shouldn't be burning oil and gas to power transportation. Maybe we can look toward new energy vehicles. And they didn't even call it electric vehicles at the time. They called it new energy vehicles, anything that didn't use a combustion engine, right?
And this went far back to what year?
To 1999. They had something called the
They
Clean
already
Auto
had that
Auction.
foresight of this.
Yeah, there was already the seeds of this in the turn of the century. They went and hired a fuel cell engineer, not an EV expert, a fuel cell engineer from Audi, a fellow named Wan Gong, an overseas Chinese who came back and ran for a period the Ministry of Science and Technology, the first non-party member to run a Chinese government ministry, because they felt that the technological innovation around mobility was going to be a critical piece of the puzzle for the 21st century Chinese economy. And he launched this 3 program, which prioritized investments in alternative fuel vehicles, including fuel cells, including battery technologies, including electric motors. And this was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago.
Chinese, they have this long view. They've been just quietly building things out. It's not like they came out of nowhere.
Right. And these seeds were planted decades ago. And I don't think it gets enough credit, but there was a company that emerged here. And I remembered well because this is before I moved to China. We had a team scouting for batteries, not for EVs, but for cells, for powering low voltage applications in vehicle. And they went to meet with a person in Shenzhen who had this company. I think it was called Bird initially. And it was a cell maker for for mobile phones. And when they got there's a procurement team from Chrysler. They came back with this story of this guy in Shenzhen who thinks he's going to make cars powered by batteries. That was Wang Chuanfu. That was the BYD company. It's now called BYD. It was 2 or 3 years later. I moved to China about a year after they came back with that story of this crazy guy in Shenzhen who thinks he's going to make a car. 2 or 3 years later, Warren Buffett invested in that company and gave it the boost it needed to get through its early stage of development. And by the way, BYD wasn't born a battery EV company. They were born a battery company, made its first moves into the automotive industry by making cars that were arguably copies of Toyota's outer appearance, powered by gasoline, but cheaper. And over time, they've morphed into this company that now sells more cars than anybody else in China. And that's a 20-year journey. But the foresight of Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett to spot this company in 2000 and invest it. I mean, Warren Buffett will today say this is the best investment they ever made. Best bet they ever made was on this company rising to become the powerhouse that it now became. But this was in part, and that's, by the way, unlike a lot of theory around here says there's this wizard standing behind a curtain pressing buttons that are going to be disadvantageous to the foreign and it's going to benefit the state. BYD is a private company. You can't say all of this is yes, it's statecraft and supporting mechanisms that the government may promote, like new energy vehicles, like subsidies, like certain purchase and manufacturing investments. But that's what a progressive top-down system can do that you are going to be competing with. The multinational automakers didn't really understand that even though consumers and the market in China hadn't embraced early the Chinese brands, but there was a commitment that was being made to investing in the next generation even 20 years ago. And we're now seeing the benefits of that play out in the market. That the investments made not just in building up EV manufacturing know-how. And again, I go back to this idea that mobility innovation in the 21st century is going to take on a different character than the 20th century. If China was to become this powerhouse in transportation or in the overall sector of transportation, that it needed to prioritize weaning itself away from the technologies that dominated the 20th century and into the technologies where it could hope to be playing on a more level playing field. And I'll add one other thought to this, that it's not just the automotive industry, it's the whole transportation sector. China has the largest high-speed rail network deployed, and they didn't invent the high-speed rail. That was something that had been invented elsewhere, but super scaled in China. They have the most modern airport infrastructure, transportation infrastructure that's really unrivaled anywhere else on the planet.
Well, for a couple decades, they're really focused on building out the infrastructure that I'm sure it's tied to their economic development goals. I want to talk about where you see this shift in terms of when China truly became the leader, whether noticed by the world. I think in your words, it's the internet of mobility.
Again, I go back to my start. I was at IBM, and I watched that industry evolved from a hardware centralized computing way of thinking about the world where the computer was the center of the world, that mainframe computer, to a distributed computing world where PCs and mobile phones now became the biggest computing devices that human beings actually interact with. The shift in the paradigm of democratization of information is also very relevant to what we see playing out in China with what I call the democratization of mobility. Henry Ford was the pioneer of the 20th century automotive industry because he made the car. He didn't invent the car. He made it affordable.
He made it affordable.
He made it affordable. He took the car that was a rich person's toy and turned it into something that anybody who worked in a factory could own.
Right.
And that changed the world. The machine that changed the world. Credit to Henry Ford for having the vision of democratization of mobility. In China, democratization of mobility takes on a different, more technology backed character. Democratization means I don't have to own the hardware. I can pay for the marginal use of the hardware. And then, by the way, they didn't invent that either. That was Uber and Lyft and companies like it. But in a market where riders outnumber drivers by it at the beginning, maybe 10 to 1, now it may be 2 or 3 to 1, you're addressing a much bigger market. And what that did is that brought internet companies into the mobility problem solving. Internet companies called Alibaba with an app called Didi, Dache, and Tencent, another big internet giant in China that most famous for its WeChat platform.
And Xiaomi.
And its gaming platform. They came into the automotive industry through the ride-hailing segment. And since then, you've had more and more internet companies, Tencent, Ali with Neo and Xpeng. You now have Huawei and you've got Xiaomi in the business of specifying not just providing apps to access mobility, but actually making the cars themselves. Designing and making a car as a mobile internet connected vehicle, an intelligent connected vehicle. China calls these EVs that have these internet features intelligent connected vehicles. They recognize that the data aggregation potential of the platform has the ability to unlock new ways of monetization, that it isn't just about how many units of hardware you sell, it's about how much you can do to democratize mobility, how much you can build the car as part of the energy storage capacity of the car, as part of the grid, as part of the energy infrastructure. And you can think of the users in vehicle as data streaming or as location-based consumers of information. So the idea of the car as a computer is far different evolving from China than I see anywhere else in the Western world.
Now it makes a lot of sense why I have to say I was questioning why did Xiaomi get involved in making cars? This concept of Internet of mobility. So cars are not just, a thing for you to drive, but another type of intelligence, right?
Right.
That's a little bit scary, to be honest. If you hear about it in the US, especially with this national security lens, or how much
Right.
data you collect, that become an issue. And I'm sure you track this. You have congressional members say, of course, we cannot allow those cars into our country because they're going to collect all the data.
Yeah. Well, that's where there is room. Let's forget it's China for a moment. The idea of a mobile device having wheels. Why aren't we doing this? The issue is,
I mean, Tesla was the first
yeah,
one.
but they're not a data aggregator at scale in the digital ecosystem sense that we have in China. They're not a mobile payment platform. They're not a
Not as
social
integrated.
network. Elon Musk, I would say, part of what motivated him to acquire Twitter is he probably saw what the Chinese companies were doing that were facing him as competitors, and he said, "Hey, maybe I need a social network and a mobile payment platform and an actual app that hosts all that." But the idea of buying into a digital platform that could then complement the data aggregation potential of a huge supercomputer. I mean, the cars of the future, let's call them what they're becoming, not what they were. They're not analog devices that are only about the driving experience. They're digital devices that serve every user in vehicle. And they have massive data aggregation capabilities. If you have a device, our phones, the phones we carry in our pocket, collect information about everything we do, what we shop for, what we eat, where we are. The car is a bigger computer, and it has bigger data aggregation capability. This is nothing that the Detroit auto industry or Wolfsburg or Stuttgart or Munich, the engineering cultures of these companies are mechanical engineers. They're not software engineers. They don't come from the internet world. In China, the internet world is commingled with the automotive world. And unlike the rest of the world, where Detroit and Silicon Valley are far away and they don't play well together, China, you've got
yeah, you have
automotive.
Google, right?
You got automotive companies in Shenzhen, which is a technology incubator, as a technology accelerator. You've got BYD sitting alongside Tencent in the same city. You've got Xiaomi sitting alongside car companies in Beijing. The separation between tech and manufacturing is not and this internet economy at scale, this Chinese internet economy. We didn't talk about that much, but the internet economy in China was born around the mobile device. It wasn't born in the desktop or mainframe era where
so they had the advantage of leapfrog.
They have a consumer population that is 100% whose lives have been transformed in a far more fundamental way by internet app-based services, many of which engage mobility, right? Whether it's people movement or food delivery or package delivery, mobility is in the value chain of the internet economy, and transforming the car from an analog to a digital device as part of a platform is something that I think is the bigger disruption. The world thinks of this as an EV discontinuity. It's far bigger than that. It's an Internet of Vehicles discontinuity. And the reason why foreign brands are losing relevancy in China is they didn't even think of that. They're worried about, how do I make the wheel turn with an electric motor and where do I get my batteries from? They're thinking about the hardware part. That's important. But even if you have that, you're still not going to sell the car because the person in that car wants a digital experience, not just a driving experience.
If I want to say there's one thing I learned from this conversation, that's it. And I hope that's what we bring to the audience, is this very concept. Now, I do want to talk about the trade war, both the first Trump trade war and the current one, and the impact on the automobile industry. I thought it was really interesting that you think that the first trade war helped globalize Chinese companies. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, let me speak metaphor first. If you put a dam on a river, does it stop the water from wanting to flow? No, it just redirects it. So I think what happens is what China's exporting to the world is what we came here for. affordability. If our companies came here because they couldn't compete with East Asia, then Japan and Korea, on price because of the high cost, then what happened, not only they came here to get low cost, and what they found is it was a big market, and and people initially were loving their products, and we all grew happily. And when they were going through their Chapter 11, China saved the business probably for them.
Yeah.
So the idea of this was all good until Chinese companies had the audacity to actually
Challenge.
build their own confidently made cars backed by the very same, very highly scaled supply chain that we all loved until suddenly it was being used by Chinese companies. And by the way, there are Chinese components in every vehicle sold in the United States. You just don't have a Chinese logo on the hood. When Chinese cars show up with their own logos, then all of a sudden, hey, wait a minute, I don't want those parts wrapped in a Chinese package. That suddenly becomes a threat, especially if now we have this big scare that EVs, which, by the way, 33% of the cars in the world are made in China, 70% of the electric vehicles are made in China. So the dominance of China in that category is what everybody's noticed. They don't think about or care about the internet features other than to maybe we can block them if we put up a barrier on the intelligent connectivity stuff. I think what will happen is whatever barrier goes up, they'll find a way around. That doesn't mean they're going to circumvent and come in, right? There may be ways to think about how to do that. But I think what happens is the Chinese brands, with the value proposition of affordability, and affordability is universal. If you can make a product with good content, even some of these high-tech features, affordable, everyone's going to want that.
Yeah, people want that. So there is a demand. So I think
there's a universal value proposition that China can hit, which is affordability. And when you put up the dam, if you put up a wall around a country, then all the other countries become fair game. And if that dam is made in China, is what I'm trying to keep out, then what happens is Chinese companies will invest outside of China sooner than they would have otherwise. They will do it anyway. I mean, as the Japanese did. The Japanese may have built 28% of the world's automobiles in Japan, but now they're building them in the United States. And we don't seem to have a problem with that, as long as they're building them in the U.S. What's different now? If China has batteries and technologies that are useful for the auto industry to have access to, what's wrong with using that if we have the security of knowing that it's inside of our controlled environment? The downside is you're breaking the scale of the supply chain by regionalizing it, and that adds cost.
using this current administration's rationality, they rather increase the cost and regionalize or fragmentize, the supply chain because they believe that this will help bring jobs back to those industries.
I'm not anti-tariffs if they serve a strategic goal. And I would say if anyone cares to study how China got to where they are, were tariffs used as a way to get localization to occur? Absolutely they were.
Yeah. Almost all countries use tariffs as a way to
I wouldn't have come here. I wouldn't have come here. I could have done everything remote control. Most multinationals came here because they were guided by policy. At the end of the day, you need to compete in your market with products that deliver a value proposition that consumers are willing to pay for. If price is a driver for market acceptance, and it usually is, then it made sense to invest, and you accepted the fact that the requirement for a foreign company to do business here was to form a 50-50 JV. To form a 50-50 JV. Part of that required building local up to 40%. It was initially 40% and then scaled up, and it was the powertrain that they wanted you to localize. So it was a very purposeful policy led with tariffs, but the tariffs go away if you form a JV and you localize these types of components. If you have rules like that, then they will be followed if people want access to your market. So my question to the policymakers is, why don't we have a policy? The policy can't be it's tariffs, end of story, because that is forcing your market to have a regional only focus hoping that the better option is not made known to your customers, right? The more affordable products are not made known to your customers. In China, people can get a car for $10,000 well configured as an EV. You're never going to see that in the United States. You're never going to see that in the United States. You're going to need access to the globally scaled supply chain for the critical components, and that's batteries, that's core electronics, that's not necessarily all the chips, but there are certain components that it only makes sense because they're becoming commodity. And that's what we don't have. We don't have a policy that's guiding investments. If making that technology in China is viewed as a security risk, then encourage the companies that can to form partnerships. Those can be licensing arrangements, those can be tech transfer arrangements, but have a policy that encourages the flipping of the script of what China did to the world. What China did was they guided foreign investment so that they could control the supply chain of the ingredients needed to make cars. Well, if you want that river to flow back to you, then what's the policy that's going to encourage that to happen? Because you're not going to get the kinds of technologies that China has scaled from any other place on the planet right now other than China.
I have two questions. One is the current tariffs. What would the policies, will do to the auto industry in the future? Not just the U.S., but also China and potentially other countries as the first one. And the second question is, help us imagine, because of those policies, how do you envision the world, let's say 5 years from now? What are we going to see in terms of transportation?
The immediate aftermath of the policy is China's remixing and redirecting. Take the EU example, is they only applied the tariffs to the EU, right? And they're only applicable to their markets. They're only on BEVs. So one implication of that is, okay, you don't want me to sell you BEVs. What if they're a hybrid? What if it's a gasoline vehicle? They have those too. So they'll remix. First thing is, okay, tell me what's going to be hit with a tariff and let me sell you what's not hit with a tariff. In the US case, it's across the board, everything's hit. So it's like, okay, then don't go there. Go where people want what we can offer, which is affordable.
So it is the rest of the world.
The rest of the world. But that includes Mexico, where there's already high penetration of made in China products. By the way, not all made by Chinese companies. There's a lot of made in China Chevrolets. That are sold.
Yeah.
There's a lot of made in China Kias that are made in China. There's a lot of components. No, that's not to say Mexico's this, back door for the U.S. They're selling in Mexico, right? That's what. And Mexico actually exports most of what it makes to the United States, but consumes most of what it makes from Asia, because in Mexico, affordability matters. And affordability matters to all of the emerging markets. Latin America, South Asia, Africa, Central Asia, Middle East. These are the markets where the Chinese are going to and not prioritizing the U.S. So actually all you're doing is
or Europe, it sounds like.
And if the tariffs are about what's made in China, then that could be used in a positive way. Europe said you have a tariff to make BEVs, and what did BYD do? Okay, I'll build a factory in Hungary. Or Chery will work with a Spanish company and build vehicles in Spain. So it accelerates. It doesn't stop the move of China going global. It makes it happen sooner. Because being a global company isn't making in your own country and exporting. The end game is to build the facilities around the world. So you are actually, with tariffs, causing China to disaggregate its supply and regionalize its supply.
And that's what you meant, that the trade war actually helped globalize Chinese companies.
Yes, it's the unintended consequence. If the intent was to stop China from becoming global, the unintended consequence, it's actually doing the opposite of that. And the other one is we put up other restrictions like CFIUS, not just tariff protection, but entity lists used to block the acquisition of technologies by China. in effect happens when you put these kinds of restrictions is you restrict the access to capital. If capital flow from the east to the west was helping fund the development of some startup companies, you've made it harder for them to accelerate. They can incubate technology, but because of the lack of globalization, because of the regionalization, a lot of these technologies are not able to scale. The technologies of the next generation for mobility require the car go through the metamorphosis from caterpillar to butterfly. The more you design a car as a computer, that means getting rid of all of the exploding lubricants and turning it into a rolling skateboard. Then you can install more compute technologies in the vehicle and enable it to be this AI-based self-driving vehicle. So I think that the stunting of the growth of the technology of the 21st century automotive industry is what the consequence is of slowing the evolution of the caterpillar into the butterfly being the fully electric vehicle.
When Washington, D.C. created those policies, they probably didn't realize how advanced the auto industry has become in China. So the policy responses don't really reflect that. It seems to be based on still thinking the best still is in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think that's number one is we tend to look at China through the rearview mirror of history. We look at where it was, not where it is, or where
in the future,
where it aspires to be. And I think that's, first of all, it is more forward, future focused. It's not trying to protect the past. It has no interest in being the China of the 1980s and 1990s. It wants to be first century technology led. And I think that is the difference between the way we think of manufacturing in the West and the way it's thought of in China today. Today's China, not the way it once was. We tend to relegate manufacturing industries to this Rust Belt definition, right? This idea that it's an aging industry, we need to breathe life into the old patient and keep it alive, but we don't ask it to become young and healthy. The vision of what it needs to become, it's not just making the stuff, it's also building the infrastructure around it, right? We did a very good job with the internet of unlocking the potential of the information technology era. But that wasn't viewed as a manufacturing industry, and that was a global industry. All the computer makers leveraged global supply chains, which made the devices, the mobile phones and all the things that we carry with us as technology more affordable over time. The reason why that computer, in fact, the computer that we used to buy in the 80s and 90s, that cost $10,000. I think the first Apple Mac computers were ridiculously high priced. Now you can get them for less than $1,000. You can get, why? Because the super scaled supply chain of core electronics, guess where that's located? That's located in somewhere other than the United States. The automotive industry, they aspired to be competitive globally, but in order to be competitive globally, they needed to be globalized, not regionalized. If you're worried about restrictions of certain technologies, then regionalize the ones that are technologically relevant to regionalize. Create policies that don't allow the data to leave the country. Allow the data only to be used and managed by local enterprises. Guess who does that? China does that. That is exactly the way they've designed their system.
Yeah, the localized data center. So help us envision what transportation mobility looks like 5 years from now.
Yeah,
in China first, because it seems like most innovative things will happen in China.
Yeah, transportation is broader than just automotive. Automotive, I think you're going to see the realization of the fully self-driving machine.
Self-driving.
Full self-driving by 2030, we're going to have, it's not going to be, right now we have driver-assisted technologies, but the step to autonomy aided by the goods and package delivery, I think that's, the focus in China is actually not robo-taxi. It's package delivery. It's this big,
those drones, right?
Yeah, people consume, shop, and eat all the stuff that moves around on wheels today. I think we're going to see a large section of that get deployed by robots within the next 5 years, certainly 10 years, and it'll happen faster because the presence of the internet giants and having the value chain of mobility being inside their ecosystem. You don't really have the equivalent of that in the rest of the world. Uber is a standalone app. Amazon standalone app. They are experimenting in mobility, mainly VTOL. They've invested in certain EV companies, but they're not as aggressively, they're not like Tencent or Alibaba and companies that are actually in the business of moving people and things and designing vehicles that optimize those. So I think we're going to see that happen. The other thing I'd say, don't lose sight of other form factors. I mean, China accelerated the mass commercialization of high-speed rail. They're now experimenting with a train that goes even faster than that, double the speed of that.
What's that called?
I don't know what the name is, but I just saw the...
Is that the one that they use in Shanghai that was between airport
maglev. Yeah, it was a maglev. It is a maglev. The maglev system actually does go between the airports in China, but they have, in Shanghai, but they have another product that goes like 600 miles an hour. It's like the speed of an aircraft on the ground.
So they will be probably the first in the world to have that?
Oh, for sure. Options for people to move around are far greater in convenience and availability, which, by the way, has put a limit on the number of cars that need to be sold, because a car is not necessary to have in China. You don't need it to function in the economy the way you do.
Which actually solves their air pollution problems, which
and noise pollution. I mean, when you walk around a city in China with high EV penetration, you really notice that there's not a lot of noise. Even the scooters, the delivery scooters, are all electric. So it is a cleaner and quieter, even though it's incredibly dense population place to live.
So if you were sitting in Washington, D.C., or sitting in one of the headquarters in Detroit, what decisions will you make? Because it sounds like it's pretty fatalistic if you frame it from the competition perspective.
I think you have to accept the world isn't what you'd like it to be. It's what it's become, which is a far more, I'd say, regionalized, ossified world, right? That we, the globalized world, like it or not, is being challenged for geopolitical reasons. It doesn't mean there aren't ways to navigate, to be able to compete in a less globalized, more regionalized world. Let's just state the first thing is China is electrified mobility, and that's been transformative to the auto industry. And if I'm a U.S. auto company, I have to be able to look at the cost structure, the standards, and the innovation speed emanating from China, and recognize that that's the competition that I'm going to be measured against. And I need to learn to compete with that. And I have to be able to access some of its capabilities and scale in order to compete with it. In order to compete with China, you need some of China in your system, especially the batteries. Let's get out of thinking of China from the lens of 20 years ago. If I'm a company in a hardware-centric industry, I have to think about a digital-first strategy. You don't want to be Nokia in a world of the smartphone. Yes. If the car is becoming a smart device, how do I build digitally relevant features? And even if you block Chinese OS companies, you still need to have an OS. You still need to have an operating system. Even if Huawei is not in the vehicle, or even if Xiaomi is not the operating system, or Ali operating system is not in the vehicle, I need something. I need some digital relevancy in order to be competing with companies that have designed the car around that idea. The third part is, how do I build these public-private partnerships in ways that allow the infrastructure to be built around whatever the next generation of technology is? If it's a connected device, how do I make sure that the connectivity in vehicle is not standalone, but it's part of a distributed network, digital and energy services? What China did very well, we didn't talk about this, is they invested far ahead of the electric vehicle in the energy infrastructure, in the charging infrastructure. And they're going even for now that CATL is listed, very successful listing in Hong Kong. What are they going to do with that money to go global with the infrastructure? How do I work with a CATL? Yeah. Not only in sourcing my batteries, it becomes political.
Are they on the entity list in the U.S.?
We can debate how and why those lists are formed.
I wanted to point that out because the policymakers, when they created those policies, probably really did not think these are truly competitive companies.
We're thinking about this and saying, okay, what's the quickest way to avoid any China coming into the system? Put them on the entity list.
Yeah.
And then let the facts fall because, okay, it's Chinese, they must have some government
Yeah.
backing. Of course they do. Who doesn't? Tesla has government backing, but they sell in China. There
So
may be some restrictions on how you allow that technology to be used. You certainly don't want CATL to be 100% owned in the country that you're selling the batteries to. But if they're helping you build the infrastructure, if they're helping you build the charging facilities or the energy storage facilities, right, that's money you don't have to spend. That's infrastructure that would take you years to build on your own. And you may never be able to build it at the same cost structure.
there's this, argument that BYD is so popular because it's government subsidized and it's dumping in the world. Do you agree with that?
I don't, because first of all, they are selling almost 4 million cars. I don't see anybody going to a BYD showroom and saying, man, I'm sure glad the government put all this money in my pocket. The subsidies to the consumer have been weaned down over time. And I could make a similar argument that any company that's trying to replace a 100-year-old incumbent better have some support. If the result you're trying to achieve is to replace a 100-year-old internal combustion, 140 years since Carl Benz invented the combustion engine and put it in a wheeled vehicle. And if the roots are that deep, then some level of public support in building infrastructure and incentivizing companies to invest to be able to compete with a 140-year-old incumbent. And by the way, China's EV policy wasn't its own idea. They actually looked to the state of California and adapted carbon trading credits and mandates that were patterned what the United States, I'd say the most progressive state in the United States, did to create Tesla. And not talked about here is that policy change that China implemented in 2017 to drop the 50% cap encouraged Tesla to be the first company to come in to build their gigafactory in Shanghai. And since 2020, when Tesla opened the gigafactory, the market for EVs in China has risen from 5% to over 50%. It's not because Tesla's getting the business. It's because you needed Tesla to spark consumer interest in the product. So BYD is the great democratizer of the electric vehicle. It's what my Chrysler people observed. This crazy guy in Shenzhen who was then in his 30s thinking he's going to be a car company. He makes cell phone batteries today. That was the observation. That guy's not a state-owned enterprise. That BYD company is a private company, and they changed the world in a direction that I think the world wants to go in. They changed the world in a direction that the world has. For a long time, we say decarbonization and repowering transportation is a key part of decarbonization. The transportation sector is the number one consumer of carbon-based energy resources. We're going to decarbonize. We must prioritize electrification of transportation. We must repower transportation. And if there's some aspect of what can come from China that can help you accelerate that, then we should be shooting for that. I think that's what the EU is trying to do. This is what the policymakers need to understand, is that just blocking China from getting to the U.S. means China's going to prioritize going everywhere else. And the EU is far more committed to decarbonization than the United States is.
But they're still trying to put some kind of tariffs, right?
Tariffs as a negotiating tool to achieve a policy objective. That's different than tariffs as an end unto itself.
So you think in the EU, in the end, they'll still let the BYDs in, even though
They're going to do it. They're going to build an R&D center in Hungary.
Yeah.
So Turkey did the same thing. He comes in and says, I'll build a factory in Turkey. Guess what? No other car company is going to do that. I can do it, and I can help you get to the EV future. So figure out what you're trying to accomplish, and figure out how to get China to give you something that you need in order to accomplish that. And again, are the tariffs the beginning of a conversation, or are they the end of the conversation? Because right now, the way China views it, the way Chinese companies are looking at this, it's end of story. I don't have to worry about the United States. Let me focus elsewhere.
That's the challenge in our DC policy world is it doesn't really know what it wants from China. And
We've gone from visionary leaders of the technology revolution as the United States to let the industries that beat to the drum of a quarterly earnings cycle dictate the pace of innovation, to now let's make policy decisions
fear
based on a 24-hour news cycle.
and fear. Well, Bill, I mean, I am so pleased that we got to have this conversation. So thank you. Just a day before my conversation with Bill Russo, CATL, the world's largest provider of EV and energy storage batteries, began trading on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange on May 20th, 2025. The shares surged over 16%, demonstrating strong demand and making it the largest listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange since 2021. Meanwhile, CATL has been classified as a Chinese military company by the U.S. Department of Defense since January 2025 and has vowed to address this false designation. In addition to geopolitical and trade policies, the fierce competition from China poses significant uncertainty for the American automotive industry. Is it time for a new way of thinking? Could integrating some Chinese components be the path to survival, as Bill Russo argued? Stay tuned for more on the rapid transformation of the Internet of Mobility. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next week.